Hey everyone, welcome. I'm Paul Fever, the Xojo developer evangelist, and I'm here to talk to you about pragmatic programming. So this topic isn't specific to Xojo or any programming language really. These are just some high-level concepts that hopefully will help you in general be a better programmer. So what I mean when I say pragmatic? Well, the official definition here you can read, dealing with things sensibly and realistically is based on practical rather than theoretical considerations. So the idea is, you want stuff that actually is going to work. So the first thing I like to remind people of is that just take a step back and think. Ponder the problem before you jump right in. Particularly with tools like Xojo, it's easy to just fire up an IDE and start dragging and dropping things, and next thing you know, boom, you're building and you got yourself an app. But sometimes it's better to just take a few moments, take a step back, think about what you're trying to do first. Do a little research. Maybe look at some other examples of what you're trying to create. Put a plan together. Now, I don't mean some big giant project plan or anything like that. Just have a sketch of what it is you intend to try, what you're trying to do. Keeps you focused, keeps you pointed in the right direction. Discuss what you're intending to do with someone else. You'd be surprised how often that is helpful. Just discussing it with a coworker, or it doesn't even have to be a technical person necessarily, but they might ask a question or make a comment that'll have you think about something you hadn't considered. And then maybe take a few minutes to think about how long what you're trying to do might take. Obviously, estimating is guessing at best. But, try and get a feel for it. Is this something you think you're going to knock off in an afternoon, or is this, a bigger thing? And if it's a much bigger thing, maybe you want to think about maybe breaking it down into smaller pieces that you can better understand. So just take a moment and think about that. And you don't have to be a slave to formal methods. There are formal methods for all of these things, for project planning in particular. And you don't have to, always do the same thing every time. Every project is different. So, it's good to be aware of some of these things, but you don't have to adhere to them 100%. And the goal when you're doing anything should be to make it better than it was. So care about what you do, care about your craft. And this will allow you to want to fix things as you're working on it. So this is particular when you're going back to something that you've been working on. The first time you do it, you probably thought it was the best idea ever, but future you is going to disagree. So when future you is working on something, fix bad designs that the you from the past created, or even someone else. Correct any wrong decisions that were made. One of the benefits of software is that it is soft, so it is changeable to some extent, so you can make changes to things. You can update poor code. And the comment you often hear people say is the worst code is the code you wrote 6 months ago. So, theoretically, as you've been programming longer, you have a better idea how to do things. Maybe the tools added newer features or something like that. So you can make sure you update stuff to make things work better, make them easier to understand. Along with that, you want to manage your code debt. And that is places where maybe you took shortcuts just to get a project finished and perhaps didn't do something in a way that is a great long-term solution. You don't want to let too much of that accumulate, because at some point your project might crash, as in be unmaintainable, not as in running, but it might just become too much of a burden for you to work on, and then you'll get the feeling that you just want to throw it all out and start over. So try not to let your code get to that point. And balancing all that together is to remember that perfect is the enemy of good. So this is an important one, because everyone wants stuff to be, as good as they can make it. But if you spend so much time getting every single little detail absolutely perfect, you're never going to finish. And then you'll never make something that's actually good and useful. And you'll just constantly be working on something. And that can be frustrating. And remember, and as a developer, you probably know this, but all software has bugs. And you kind of going to have to accept it. This is easier, I think, for developers to accept than people who aren't programmers, aren't developers, who can't really comprehend that all software has bugs, but it is a true statement. And the key is finding them and fixing them when you do find them. So one way to help with all this is to actually to do less. So when you're starting off with something, ignore a lot of the nitty-gritty details. They can really bog you down. And then one way to force you to do less is to essentially ship early and ship often. If you're doing this, it'll prevent you from taking on something huge that may take you an incredibly long amount of time to finish, because you can't really ship often if you're spending months and months or years and years working on some particular feature or app. And by doing less, it means you're going to have less bugs. There's less stuff there that can go wrong. And remember this helpful acronym. You can write it on your whiteboard. But generally speaking, you're not going to need it. When you're designing stuff or talking with users or getting feedback from business analysts or whatnot, they're going to want everything in the kitchen sink. Because, well, it seems like a good idea. While you're in there, why don't you just add this? And odds are it's not going to be needed. And spending time writing code, testing code, maybe creating bugs for things that aren't needed, that's a really bad idea. So leave it out. If it turns out it's truly needed, people will let you know. Pardon my French here, but not half-assed. So by doing less, that means you can focus your efforts on the right things, and you can do a really good job at them, rather than doing a bunch of things and doing maybe not so great job on all of them. And going back to you're not going to need it, just beware the bloat monster. It is so easy to add everything that you can think of or that other people say they want. Because you're in there, because they're the paying customer or whatnot. Sometimes you need to push back on these things because it'll make the software worse. So beware the bloat monster. Always be coding, ABC. So essentially, this just means practice, but there's lots of ways you can do it. And to be a better coder or be better at anything, really, you have to practice. So one way you can practice coding is to participate in open source projects. I remember when I started, you can date me by this little anecdote, but when I started coding, programs were printed in magazines and you typed them in on the computer to get them. Getting them on disk, so you didn't have to type them, was often very expensive. So I would spend hours as a teenager typing programs in from magazines. And that was a lot of fun because you got to see how they worked because you were actually physically typing them in. But even more fun was after the fact, modifying these programs that I had typed in to change the behavior or see how they worked. And you start off doing small things, changing screen titles or giving yourself extra lives in a game or something like that. But these days, open source projects is a great way to do that because you can pull down the entire project with all its source code and play around with it, make changes. Maybe you'll even come up with a change that is useful enough. You can push it back to the open source project and they'll incorporate it. If you go to GitHub, you can search for Xojo and you'll find there's over 300 Xojo open source projects. So any of those can be a great place to start and grab and take a look at. You may have heard of the 10,000 hours rule. A lot of people say that you really need to have 10,000 hours of something of practice, essentially, under your belt before you can really be considered an expert. Obviously, this is just a high-level thing, but I do think that lots and lots of practice, again, is key to being good at something. And of course, as I mentioned before, modify and learn from other people's code. So open source projects are a great way to see other people's code that you can easily modify. So you can start with that. Also, over the summer, this past summer, here at Xojo, we did the Just Code Challenge. Every week throughout the summer, we asked people to make an app and then make it available for others to look at. So the source code was made available. So you can check out the blog post here. This went on for the whole summer, so like 14 weeks, I think. And we had over 100 different projects submitted. So there's lots of a variety of things you can take a look at here, from games to business apps to utilities. Along with coding is learning, and you want to always be learning. There's lots of ways to do this. You can go to conferences. And of course, I have to mention the Xojo Developer Conference in 2019. You can check that out at our website. It's in May, the beginning of May, Miami, Florida. Nice and warm. I can't wait because it's already super cold here in New England. So conferences are a great way to learn new things. You can, of course, get actual training. You can pay someone to train you on a topic. You can attend webinars, watch videos, that sort of thing. Whatever works for you. Read books. Another great way to learn is to read about general programming topics as opposed to things that are just specific to the tools you use necessarily. So that can broaden your horizons, maybe give you some ideas for things that you might want to apply to whatever it is you happen to be using. A great site, this is relatively new. It's been around for almost a couple of years now, I think, dev.20. And it's a programming community, general purpose programming community. There's topics on everything programming related. And you can write your own stuff, which is awesome. So if you have something to say about anything in particular, you can essentially post your own blog right to dev.20. There's lots of discussions and other things. So a great community for general purpose programming topics. And of course, participate in forums. The Xojo forum for Xojo developers is a great place to participate, obviously. So I encourage people to do that. There are other forums as well. These days, I think something like dev.20 with a more of a community type thing is probably a better place to hang out. But definitely things like that are great for learning. And try new things. And try things you already know too. So even if you're learning these things, maybe reread it. Give yourself a refresher. Maybe you'll pick up something that didn't quite stick the first time you thought you learned it. And perhaps the best way to learn something new is to actually try to teach it to someone else. Because if you can explain it to someone else, then you probably know it pretty darn well. So, and there are lots of ways to teach, from, writing a blog post about a topic, explaining it, to even, recording your own videos, putting them on YouTube, to presenting at a conference. Lots of options there. All right, when you're working on stuff, eventually something bad's going to happen. Something's not going to work. You'll get frustrated. But don't just start guessing. One of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite movies, Apollo 13, is Gene Kranz, after the Apollo 13 ship had a bit of a problem and the astronauts were in deep trouble. Everyone on the ground was scrambling to figure out what it could be, what they needed to do. And it was kind of chaotic. And he just kind of yelled out, "Work the problem, people. Let's not make things worse by guessing." And that applies to lots of things in life, but in programming, I think it also applies. So, think about what's going wrong. What did you expect to happen? Why is it not happening? What changed recently? Did you add some new code? Did you change some part of your tool system, your tool chain? Think about all these things. Don't just immediately throw your arms up and have a panic attack and say, "Oh my God, I'm doomed. Nothing's going to work ever again." If it worked at one point, it'll probably work again. And if you clear your mind, you'll probably figure it out. So just don't panic. And one thing I do like to remind people is this phrase, select is not broken. And you see this a lot from really inexperienced developers, where they will create something and it doesn't work. And then they immediately think, "Oh, well, the compiler's not working," or the if statements are broken. Or in this case, this means the select statement in a database is broken. Odds are pretty low that such a fundamental thing is broken, because if it were broken, the tool would be pretty much utterly useless and no one would get anything done with it. But if it's just you not getting anything done or having a problem, maybe you need to rethink your assumptions and maybe you've made a mistake. So again, take a step back and think about what's going on there. And related to this, remember, with software, there's really no dead ends. There's almost always multiple ways to solve a problem. So if it turns out your one way to solve a problem isn't working for you anymore, well, find another way. And if you're working on something and you come up with a technique that works, don't just say, all right, I got it, I'm working, that's the way to go, boom, let's move on. Think about it. Make sure that that's really what's going to be the best choice here. And if nothing else, put a couple notes in the code for alternatives that maybe you thought of and threw away or no longer consider. Maybe that'll be helpful if you go back to the code later because of some issue. So you can just find solutions. You don't need to make excuses for why something isn't working. You can try an alternative approach. Maybe another tool will give you what you want instead of what you're using. There's lots of options. Software has lots of options for getting things done. So I like to encourage people to write. This is a hard thing. Not a lot of people like to do it. But essentially, you got to remember that English, or whatever your primary language is just another programming language, essentially, but one you're using to communicate with humans. And it is all about communication, because you actually have to talk to people to get stuff done. So one way you can communicate is blog. This is a great way to get started, because essentially, you're just writing stuff down. It's kind of one way. You're often not going to get a lot of feedback on that. So, maybe that's a little easier for you to work with. But it's a great way to just, get the writing juices flowing. I do encourage that. But having good communication and the ability to write is helpful if you have any sort of clients you're dealing with. You want to be able to explain yourself clearly. You don't want any confusion or ambiguity when you're explaining things to clients. Incredibly helpful if you're on forums. Say you have a question about something. Well, if you don't write often enough and your question is formed badly, it'll be hard for people to understand it to be able to even offer you any assistance. So it can be helpful to, practice that. Make sure you give all the appropriate information up front so people don't have to immediately follow up with your question and say, well, we need these pieces of additional information before we can even begin to help you. That just slows down the communication. And of course, clients and customers are the same often, but often you work, I suppose, more directly with clients than maybe with customers, but it's always good to be able to explain stuff to people in a clear way so that they can understand it. And whatever tools you happen to be using, know them well. First of all, you want to make sure you use the right tools for the job. You don't always choose SQLite as your database when maybe an actual database server is more appropriate. I'm sure you could probably force SQLite to behave the way you want for, maybe a larger database usage, but it might not be the best route to go. So whatever tools you do end up using, know them well. Read the documentation, play around with everything, understand how they work, what they're good at doing, what they're not good at doing. And a few that I do recommend in general is you're always going to want to have a source control system of some kind. These days, I primarily use GitHub for my own stuff. Even if you're your own sole developer and you're thinking, I don't need a source control system, I'm the only one that works on my stuff, you're wrong. You still need a source control system. It serves as a backup of sorts. More importantly, it allows you to go back to prior versions of things. It helps with the don't panic aspect, because you never fear losing any code that was working, because you can always go back to the code that was working. You don't fear making changes, because you can always go back It's like an infinite undo. So source control is super, super important. Being able to track bugs that are reported against any software you're working on is important. As I mentioned, all software has bugs. You want to keep track of those so you can take care of them. You don't, again, have to use super formal things here. For a smaller project, maybe just a list in Notepad is sufficient. But for a large multi-team project, you probably want a specific bug tracking tool that everyone can connect to and keep status on and things like that. Same with project tracking. Smaller projects can probably get by with something simple. An Excel document, for example. Larger projects may need something a bit more robust. But it's best not to just be winging it and not knowing exactly what you're trying to do or get done in the project, because it may not have an end, and that's never great. Most projects these days use a database of some kind, so you should probably know a few. I mentioned SQLite, which is a great database to use with lots of things, but certainly not everything. And there are plenty of other databases as well, Oracle, Postgres, things like that. It's good to know a little bit about those and have them in your back pocket. And of course, test early, test often. Nobody does enough testing. It's really, really hard for developers to test effectively because often especially if they're trying to test stuff they've written, because they know how it should work. So they tend to follow the exact path that the code's expected to take when they use it. And often everything just works fine for a developer because they know how to use it properly. So that can be another reason testing is so hard. You can test things manually, which is often what ends up happening for stuff that's user interface related. And you can also test things automatically so that you can have a series of tests run every time you do a build, for example, or you run your project. And they can test some low-level things to make sure stuff still works the way you expect. These are often referred to as unit tests. And if you do use Xojo, there's an open source project, Xojo Unit, that you can add to your projects to let you do unit testing. And another great way to test is to have virtual machines. So you can set up different environments, different operating systems, all that good stuff for testing purposes. Makes it a lot easier than having a fleet of computers making noise and generating heat. And of course, one of the ways that most people do their testing these days is user testing, which is essentially stamp something as a beta, ship it off to your customers, and let them help find the bugs for you. And this certainly is a great way to test because those users are going to try stuff you've never even considered or thought of. But you have to be careful to make sure that you're not leaning on them too heavily. They may resent that. So opinionated programming. When you're coding, it's good to have some general style to the way you code, some opinions about what you're doing. So you can start off a bit with just some naming conventions and coding guidelines. If you're using Xojo, we do have some in the user guide you can review to see if they something you might want to consider. What these things are, what the conventions and guidelines are, doesn't really matter. What matters is that you use them consistently so that your style shows through and that your code and your projects are easy to understand. A few that I like to use in particular are to initialize variables close to where they are used. I know a lot of people like to initialize everything at the top of a method. And maybe they're just used to that technique. Maybe they like having everything in one place, whatever. But I like to use or initialize variables next to where they're going to be used. I like to make sure the variables only have one purpose. There's, computers these days have a lot of memory, and I know people are concerned about bloat or whatnot, but there's very little reason to attempt to have a variable serve multiple purposes in a method. That's just confusing. Choose good names for things, short names, single character names, abbreviations. Maybe faster to type, but you might regret that later when you want to read it. And in my experience, you often read code way more often than you spend time writing it in the first place. A more specific thing is take advantage of enumerations and actual named constants rather than using specific values in your code. And particularly people that are coming from non-object oriented programming, I like to remind them to minimize your use of global data and methods. Try to encapsulate things into, at the very least, modules of some kind, but better classes if you're able to. Consider using select case in place of an if, where that, or a bunch of nested ifs when that makes sense. And I also like to avoid non-obvious loop and block exits, even non-obvious function exits. It makes it a little harder to read the code to know where things are because you got to pay more attention line by line. A few more. I tend to prefer using for each next whenever possible instead of using a loop counter. It is great to be a master debugger. This is incredibly helpful when things, again, are going wrong and you're trying not to panic. Using the debugger can maybe help quell your fears a little bit. I still run into a surprising large number of people, not just with Xojo, but even with other tools, that are unaware of how to use the debugger built into their tool set. Resort to logging or printing or odd things like that. And that's not super efficient. So your tool's going to have a debugger these days. Learn it and try to use it effectively. Refactor your code regularly. So anytime you have to go in and make a modification of some kind, take a moment to take a look at the method, the overall class, and see if there's something in there that can be easily improved without breaking anything. Having unit tests greatly helps with that because your tests can run to verify that things are still working the way you expect. Iterate over your changes is another great tip, which essentially means, don't necessarily take everything apart and spend a super long time adding new things to it. Just do that in small steps over and over and over. And then eventually you'll be where you want to be. Take advantage of exceptions, particularly in your Xojo code. You can catch them or raise them as opposed to using error numbers or things like that. And comment effectively. I like to, tell people, well, this means, do what makes sense. It makes no sense to me to comment every line of code with a comment above it that says exactly what the line of code says. At least particularly in a language like Xojo, which uses a nice, readable English-like syntax, the comment can be often very redundant. Instead, it's better to have comments that describe what you're trying to accomplish, why this code is here, maybe some technical details about the way it works. But, you don't need, repetitive, obvious things that you can infer from reading the code itself. I'll be doing a session about this at XTC. Avoid premature optimization. This can be a fun thing for developers to dive into, is trying to make something as fast as possible. It's a fun little exercise. It's fun to test that, to do all these timings or whatnot. And that can be great, but you have to make sure, first of all, this matters. Sometimes making things a little bit faster has no general effect on the app as a whole. And the other thing is that this can be extremely time consuming and maybe even make your code much less readable. So you want to save this for the places that is needed and when it is needed. And I like to encourage people to write shy code. And this just means make things not public unless they need to be public. So I often try to make everything private at first. And then if it turns out my design requires a particular method or a property or something to be exposed elsewhere, I will know and can think about it and can then make it public, as opposed to making everything public by default and then just kind of using stuff willy-nilly. And then you run the risk of maybe having a bit of a spaghetti code type setup where you've got a fragile dependent system. So reduce, reuse, recycle. Generally speaking, you don't want to repeat yourself when you're writing code. And one thing I like to do along this technique is when I'm updating something to actually write negative 50 lines of code, which is to add a new feature to something and end up with less code than you started with. And I've done that a lot. It is super rewarding to add functionality to an app or a project and have removed a bunch of code in the process. So you can design your code for reuse. Object-oriented programming is great for that. You can refactor code for reuse. Obviously the first time you wrote something, maybe you didn't really consider that it might be reused, but you're going back in, you're like, you know what? This section is going to be very similar to this other section. Let me see if I can rework this so that they can share that. Because copy and paste are not your friends. You could just say, I'll just copy this code from over here. I'll put it over here. Everything's working. Great, excited. Check that box and move on. And you keep doing that, and you're going to end up with a large pile of technical debt that is going to be a huge problem later. Say that code you're copying and pasting has a weird bug in it that you don't find out about until a year later, and you've copy and pasted that code multiple times throughout your app. Well, now that bug is in your app in multiple places. And you have to remember to find all those places, fix it in all those places, and odds are you'll miss something. Remember, programming's for people. So put people first. Understand what they're trying to do. Don't just code for the computer. And be yourself. Have a personality. Of course, unless you happen to be a jerk, then don't be yourself. But most people aren't jerks by default, so be yourself. And when you run into problems, which is going to happen on any project and any team, fix what the problem is. Don't, run around blaming who might have caused it. Odds are that person was doing the best they could with the information they had at the time. And maybe later it looks like it wasn't a great idea, but at the time, maybe it looked like a great idea. All you can do at this point is make things better. And remember, people are not computers and computers are not people. So speak to those type of things in the appropriate way. So remember, people will infer things based on what you say. They'll assume things. Computers generally won't. So be specific to both, but communicate appropriately. I see a lot of developers that will attempt to talk to people as if they are computers, and that puts off a lot of people. All right, so I want to recommend a few books here on these topics. These are probably 4 of my favorite books. Obviously, the first one is The Pragmatic Programmer. I had this book for a really long time, the inspiration for this brief talk. This book is, generally speaking, non-specific about any particular technology. It just has lots of great ideas and things that will help you become a better programmer. Highly, highly recommended. Also, 2 books from 37 Signals, the Basecamp company folks, Getting Real. This book actually, I believe, is free online at this URL. And this is just a short series of tips, strategies, techniques for how to get things done. And they had a follow-up called Rework. Along similar lines. These 2 books are very quick reads. They're short. Each section is very short. You can flip through this book very quickly, but highly worth reading, in my opinion. And then for a more dense tome, maybe a reference guide of sorts, is Code Complete, which has lots of high-level coding concepts and ideas and things to keep in mind. Again, not really specific to any technology or programming language, but a great book to have. All of these books are on the top shelf of my bookcase because I refer to them regularly. And lastly, last week I was doing the hour of code in my wife's middle school math classes. And she has this poster on the wall. And as I was talking to the kids, it occurred to me, I was showing them programming using Xojo and other things. It occurred to me that this poster describes a lot about programming as well as math. So I made a couple modifications that maybe will show up. There we go. So what do good programmers do? Well, I think I've covered a lot of these things in this talk here, but you look for patterns. You probably sketch out what you want to work on, estimate what it is you're trying to do, think about it, ask questions, create a plan. Very important to be able to explain what you've just coded. So, if you do get some code from a forum or a website that you want to use in your app, don't just, copy and paste it in there and trust it. Take some time to understand how it works. Test, check your work, do a good job. You want to use coding to solve everyday problems, not specifically math. Try new ways to find a solution. And, using a computer by definition is probably technology, but one thing I do like to encourage people is, be good and smart about searching for solutions. Be a master of Google and learning how to look for things. I hope these tips had some useful snippets of information for you. I can always be reached, paul@xojo.com, or on Twitter @lefevre. And I want to thank everyone for attending. Have a great day.